Hello, and welcome to the Epigenetics, PACES, and Salutogenesis DNA is not our destiny, and health is in our hands workshop. I'm Dr. Candice Jones, and I'm a board-certified pediatrician in Orlando, Florida at Edgewater Pediatrics. Today, we are going to talk about how ACEs can influence the expression of our genes and how that can be passed down through generations, but also how we can heal and promote health and well-being even in the midst of adversity. Positive, health promoting, salutogenic approach. So I'm excited about the information our speakers have for us today. Thank you all for being with us today. To our speakers, to our audience, you can find the panelists' full biographies in the conference program. Also, questions in the Q&A section. We will pose those to our speakers later in the workshop. Our first speaker is Dr. Leslie Sue Lieberman. She is Professor Emerita with University of Central Florida. Thank you so much, Dr. Lieberman, and take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. I appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. What a great keynote speaker we had this morning. And she did allude to epigenetics a little bit. I also want to thank Kelsey Visser for and Donna Walsh for the invitation to speak with you today. And let's get going. Oh, and also, of course, the wonderful tech team who are helping with this. As you heard, I'm a biomedical anthropologist and a researcher. I'm not a clinician or a practitioner, so I look forward to your comments about my presentation. I'll focus on the etiology or the causes of obesity, diabetes, eating behaviors in our current obesogenic environment. Using an evolutionary medicine approach, our perspective, it is clear that our ancestors dating back almost 200,000 years ago were both physically resilient and resided in social groups that adapted to changing environments. The forces of evolution, including natural selection, encode our genome, but it is our epigenome that modulates gene effects. Next, please. This is the basic model. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. I have an assistant. This is the basic model showing three very complex domains. At the top, cultural beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors. To the right, social and physical environment, and to the left, the biological domain, in this case, focusing on genetics and epigenetics, and these interactions, which are so critical in terms of shaping both our genes, our genome, and our epigenome. I'm going to present a brief, switched already. One more, well, I was going to say that I'm going to present a brief overview of epigenetic mechanisms, the environmental triggers that can influence them and cause alterations in gene functions, give you a few examples. And then I'm going to talk about body size and body image and the epigenetics of obesity, some information on fat shaming and that kind of toxic stress that people encountered, but also the salutogenic trend of large body size acceptance resulting in more positive childhood, adolescent, and adult experiences. On this particular slide, we've got some basic genetics. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see a mammalian cell. The purple blob there is the nucleus, and inside the nucleus is the DNA. You can see the typical double helix on the left, the DNA with a backbone of sugar and phosphate, and the bridges of these base pairs, these nucleotide pairs, adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. They match up AT and GC, and it's this GC pairing nucleotide that is a target for many epigenetic modifications. You can also see that we've got about 3 billion of these nucleotide pairs. They're arrayed in 20,000 genes in 23 pairs, 22 autosomes, and 1 pair of sex chromosomes, X and Y. It's the sequence of the bases that give us the instruction on making proteins. These complex molecules are the basis for all body tissues and biological functions. Some genes are more prone to modification than others. Next, please. What we're interested in is the production of these proteins that are encoded in the DNA sequences. So it starts out with the double helix, which unwinds and acts as a template for a single-stranded RNA that moves out of the nucleus of the cell into the cytoplasm, where it's involved in sequencing the amino acids, those building blocks of proteins, in a particular sequence in the process of translation. This takes place in the cell cytoplasm, not in the nucleus, but epigenetic changes can occur both in the cytoplasm and also in the cell nucleus. So DNA codes for these structural changes, and the control of turning on and off these structural changes is what we're looking at with epigenetics. Next, please. We start with the production of these gametes, that is, the sperm and eggs, carrying half the genetic material that eventually develops into, of course, a whole human being. I'm going to pop up here, sorry. Then with a full complement of DNA, it starts out as a pluripoint cell. And what's amazing to me is that for any particular cell type, as these cells differentiate into a blood cell or a muscle cell or a nerve cell, only about 10 to 20% of the genes are active. That means the epigenome is working already to turn on and turn off these genes at critical times. Next, please. So epigenetics is a normal part of development, even though we often study it in terms of pathology. So what is epigenetics? Epigenetics is defined as a study of biological mechanisms that switch genes or on or activate them or off or silence them, their chemical reactions, and the internal and external factors that influence them. As an organism grows and develops, this carefully orchestrated chemical reactions of activating and deactivating these genes. So epigenetics makes each of us unique. Even identical twins have different epigenetic markers. And the example here, classic example, are two mice who are genetically identical, except that the mouse at the top is the one that has a kinky tail, which is due to an epigenetic effect. Next, please. So I'm going to talk about briefly about 4 different mechanisms. Missing from this slide is RNA coding, non-coding RNA, but I'm going to talk about that as well. And so we have DNA methylation, histone modification, chromatic remodeling, and also another process which is influences non-coding RNA. And you can see in the top part of this particular illustration of DNA, there's a little yellow blob, which is a carbon atom, and 3 orange hydrogens surrounding it. That is the methyl group, and it's attaching to the CG nucleotide. Also below are the dark blue spheres. These are the protein histones. And you can see coming off these protein histones are these little blue tails. Different molecules, including methyl groups, but it can be acetyl groups and others, attached to these tails in terms of histone modification. Next, please. So DNA methylation is a normal lifetime biological process. And you can see that it's mediated here by a number of proteins and enzymes adding to the DNA. The regulatory genes control this particular process. DNA methylation is essential for normal development and is associated with normal and pathological processes in the production of gametes, biological aging. It's been implicated in Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, and a number of cancers. Hypermethylation turns off these genes, and hypomethylation turns on the genes in terms of gene expression. Next, please. We also have histone modification. So histone modification, again, are these tags on these little tails of these histones. These modifications can be methylation, acetylation, phosphorylation, and other kinds of changes. Histone modification is associated with inherited neurodegenerative diseases such as Huntington's disease, but also schizophrenia and, again, several cancers. Next, please. Chromatin remodeling is this dynamic modification of the chromatin, which is this complex of the histone and the DNA. If it's lumped together as it is at the top and heterochromatin, it is not translated. It is not active. It's turned off. If it's open and allowing the addition of various methyl groups and other groups to it, in this case, you can see an acetyl group added to this, to the histone, to the chromatin, then it is active and translating. Now, there are a number of factors that control chromatin remodeling, include DNA methylation, but also we have another process, another mechanism in epigenetic models, and this includes non-coding RNA. These are small functional RNAs that are transcribed from DNA but not translated into proteins. They're involved in both transcriptional and post-transcriptional regulation of genes, and they play a role in operating on the other mechanisms as well. Importantly, they're involved in the deactivation or silencing of one of the X chromosomes. These small RNAs have been designated with little prefixes on the RNA by their size and what their functions are. And so you have mRNA, siRNA, etc. Next, please. So we've heard this morning about the about stresses postnatally, primarily, but I also want to mention that we have transgenerational effects, which involve the maternal environment conditioning the intrauterine environment. And this is a critical period for development. This fetal period is a critical period for development, which can have lasting effects. This is the Barker hypothesis or fetal programming that give you downstream effects. Particularly studied have been the sort of deleterious effects, and the ones that I've been interested in are the risks for adult obesity and other structural changes and distribution in the fat tissue. Also, some of these other comorbidities such as diabetes. So this deleterious intrauterine environment, which can be related to maternal stress hormones, it can be related to triggers such as poor maternal nutrition, gestational diabetes, smoking, or alcohol intake, which can lead to a dysregulation of normal fetal development, resulting in a biomarker of either too high or too low infant birth weight for gestational age, and then the consequences later on. So these epigenetic effects affect hormones, enzymes, the gut microbiota or the bacteria in the gut, and the entire organism. Next, please. So I had quite a bit of information regarding these epigenetic triggers, and I realized I was going to be running out of time very shortly if I told you about many of them. But I think that it is important to just talk about a few, and I know that Dr. Jani is will be talking about some other examples as well. At the top, we have diet. So diet or epigenetics is a faceted trigger, and one that I'm particularly interested in. And we have, and epigenetic effects have been linked both to insufficiencies and excesses of the macronutrients and micronutrients, as well as food additives. However, the data is not particularly good for humans. It's difficult to draw the necessary links between correlation and causation. We sort of lack the randomized, double-blind, case-controlled studies looking at these nutritional factors. But very briefly, the ketogenic diet has been shown to have rather large or wide, genome-wide epigenetic effects, at least in animal models. The Mediterranean diet may be a maternal diet, which includes the Mediterranean diet, may have a positive effect on the developing fetus in terms of reducing the risk for metabolic syndrome later on in life. And a typical Western diet, particularly looking at the intake of low fiber but high fat, high sugar diet, has been implicated as a risk factor for children with ADHD. And also one area that I'm particularly interested in, the methylation of the gene controlling insulin-like growth factor, IGF-2, which is related to obesity. Many plant and animal foods contain methyl donors. I'm going to give you an example in just a minute. And the U.S. also fortifies foods with B vitamins such as folic acid and B12 that are also methyl donors. It was reported in the journal Child Psychology and Psychiatry that excessive intake of B vitamins led to a reduction in performance of memory tests by offspring of men who had who were involved in excessive intake, including energy drinks, which include which often have the additive of B12. We heard a little bit today about some of the seasonal, unanticipated stress factors that can happen, and how this kind of acute stress can also alter the hormonal and functioning of individuals for a longer period of time beyond the acute stress experience. Short sleep duration has shown to have many epigenetic effects that may lead to cognitive changes in cognitive function and physiological changes such as weight gain. There are many examples of diseases. The one that I want to mention is COVID-19. Severity may be enhanced because of epigenetic changes related to another ACE, ACE2 gene, that is angiotensin converting enzyme 2, which serves as the entree for the COVID-19 SARS-CoV-2 virus to get into cells and use the cell's machinery for replication. The ACE2 receptor is the target of also many drugs controlling hypertension and diabetes. But both hypertension and diabetes, as you know, are risk factors for more severe cases of COVID-19. We also have examples of many non-infectious diseases as well, such as that involved with aging, glaucoma, age-related macular degeneration, have a number of changes that are epigenetic. Finally, I want to just mention one epigenetic mechanism, which is called epigenetic imprinting. And this involves changing the epigenetic changes that occur in the same gene, but are on either the male or the female chromosome. So, for example, DNA methylation of the same gene is implicated in Angelman syndrome when it's inherited through the maternal chromosome, and Prader-Willi syndrome when inherited through the paternal chromosome. There are many toxic chemicals that occur in the environment that are particularly troublesome, and these are these long-lasting, often endocrine disrupting chemicals that make changes in the regulation of the DNA. These occur in herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, and also in the production of plastics. One of the other more microenvironmental aspects of toxic chemicals include cigarette smoking. And the cigarette smoking, with its 7,000 different chemicals that have been identified, can have a really adverse effect on the epigenetic changes that occur in fetal development, as well as later life, particularly affecting cells in the lungs. Several epigenomic-wide association studies have been done, confirming there's DNA methylation and histone hyperacetylation of lung tissues in smokers. I'm not going to talk about drug abuse. You've heard a little bit about drug use and drug abuse, but simply to note that with therapeutic drugs, as I move around this oval and these epigenetic triggers, many therapeutic drugs are now being developed that actually increase things such as increased mechanisms of methylation as a way of targeting particular cancer cells or other tissues. Exercise has also been well studied. There's an excellent meta-analysis in the journal Lifestyle and Genomics from 2019, showing that both resistance exercise and endurance exercise have wide consequences for different epigenetic mechanisms. Endurance exercise, for example, changes DNA methylation and non-coding RNA. I think that Dr. Jani is going to talk a little bit about alternative and complementary medicine. This is a great area for salutogenic approaches, but we're lacking a lot of studies. So these would include both mind-body practices, such as meditation and yoga, as well as these larger health systems, such as traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, or homeopathy. I want to kind of lump, or I'm going to lump, financial status, social interactions, and psychological state as socio-environmental factors and social determinants of health that collectively are mediated through the stress response. And I'll show this in a slide in a moment. For example, altered profiles of DNA methylation have been found in the brain specimens of children with PTSD who've had serious adverse events in childhood, adverse childhood experiences. Next, please. A couple of classic examples. In this case, diet mediates the effects of a toxin. These two mice are genetically the same, but the mouse on the left, the large yellow mouse or agouti mouse, was fed, the mother was fed a diet of bisphenol A, a toxic compound found in plastics, and a normal mouse diet. And these epigenetic changes led to an obese mouse with a biomarker of this fur color, this agouti color. This mouse is also prone to diabetes. The mouse on the right is the brown mouse, and this mother was fed also the toxic substances, but also supplemented with dietary components that were methyl donors. And you can see the illustration in the lower right-hand corner. So this is a normal mouse, and the mediation took place with methyl donation by dietary components. Next, please. This is probably a classic example of maternal care and stress. So this is a postnatal example. A mother who is quite stressed and not very good with parenting, anxious, will produce a mouse that is also anxious. A mother who is relaxed and non-anxious and good at maternal parenting will produce a relaxed mouse. However, you can change this relaxed mouse into a mouse that also is anxious with an injection of a chemical, a drug that increases methylation. So I think you're all familiar with the stress response, as we see at the top of the slide, and methylation can occur at a number of sites in the HPA axis. the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. But most significantly, I think, are the changes, the epigenetic changes that occur in the glucocorticoid receptor in the hippocampus, because it sends a signal to the hypothalamus to shut down the stress circuit. So again, this whole circuit is privy to a number of epigenetic changes. Well, I'm going to change a little bit the theme and look at another stressor, next please, that is body size and shape in the next, I think I only have about 5 minutes, is that right, to do this. Next please. So one of the other stressors that we have is this very salient component of ourselves, which our body shape. It shapes our image and it shapes our interactions with other people. Medically, only generally 2 shapes are identified: a pear shape at the bottom, which is seen as lesser risk for metabolic or cardiometabolic illnesses, and the apple shape with the accumulation in the center of the body, the centripetal accumulation of fat, abdominal accumulation of fat, which is a risk factor for cardiometabolic diseases. However, above you see these illustrations from the fashion industry to show that there are many body shapes indeed, and that they're both, you need to be both diverse and inclusive when you're involved in designing clothing. Next, please. So we have still this overriding fat stigma that can create a toxic environment throughout the life of an individual. The weight stigma or fat stigma refers to these negative attitudes towards individuals who are obese or are living with obesity, and the stereotypes that are associated with them. We do know that this is occurring in spite of the fact that normal individuals with normal weights as adults in the United States are actually in the minority. 70% of Americans are either overweight or obese. And in a 2019 study, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey of high schoolers in 9th through 12th grade, 1/3 of them were either overweight or obese. So the prevalence is high, yet a stigma remains. Next, please. We are socialized into a number of biocultural interpretations of body size. I'm using BMI, body mass index, as a shorthand for this. And I think you're all familiar with these domains of culture that are characteristics applied to body size, whether it's thin or fat or intermediate in terms of size. And so we learn about these from a variety of sources from early age on, from family, friends, teachers, doctors, TVs, movies, ads, social media, what is valued and what is desirable and what is not. So there are a number of characteristics here that include both positive and negative associations. Next, please. We also have overt prejudice and discrimination. Part of this was discussed earlier today by our keynote presenter. And these include these verbal comments that can occur in person or particularly on social media, physical bullying, relational victimization or social exclusion, not being chosen for the hockey team in high school, being ignored, and also the target of rumors. There is also institutional discrimination, both in the employment sector, in colleges, in the criminal justice system. Obese individuals are given harsher criminal sentences, but also in the healthcare sector, where it may be perceived that individuals with obesity are less compliant, they get less pain medication and fewer referrals to specialists. Next, please. Quite insidious is also unconscious or implicit bias against fat. And there are a number of these that are widespread, that are common in our environment. So very quickly, we have snap judgments, insufficient evidence, and insufficient evidence upon which to base a reaction to an individual. We might see an individual who is obese eating a hot fudge sundae and make the assumptions that they have no self-control, they don't eat wisely, they don't want to be healthy. So these kinds of implicit biases are based on this internalized schema that we have about large body size and weight. And we're unaware that we're making these assumptions generally. They're not necessarily conscious, and we don't think about them. And in fact, most people would disavow that they're engaged in these implicit bias activities, such as snap judgment. Elitist behavior is raising the bar of performance for people with obesity or downgrading their qualifications. Stereotypes we've talked about, and they're generally negative for individuals with large body size. Cloning, as we quickly go down this list, is the desire to replicate someone with your own characteristics. And we find, for example, the very important aspect of friends who look alike influencing body size even more so than family. Good fit would be a bias against individuals who are considered not really the corporate image or not part of the social group by the way they look, not their personalities or their skills. Wishful thinking is simply a dismissal, a denial that there is any fat bias. Euphemized bias. Visionary, we often give people who are non-obese the advantage of saying, well, we'll see what their vision is. She's got good vision. Where more frequently individuals who are living with obesity have to already have proven themselves. And finally, the halo effect, that if you are with somebody who is admired, a celebrity, for example, then this effect also can extend to you. So you can measure implicit bias yourself by going online at the Harvard University Implicit Attitudes or Implicit Association Test for body size. So I think I need to kind of wrap up pretty quickly. The next slide, please. And here we have social and mass media influences. We heard something about this. This is a wonderful site which gives you information about characteristics of users, behaviors online, and some content. As we heard this morning, there is an enormous amount of time spent on social media, particularly by adolescents, and the social media can have an adverse effect in terms of self-image and behaviors, including depression, suicide, deleterious eating disorders, and school performance. However, I want to turn this around a little bit to talk about the next couple of slides as I quickly finish up. Next, please. And this is Lizzo. And Lizzo has been referred to as the goddess of body positivity. She is a multi-talented superstar who wears these revealing costumes when she is performing. She is a celebrity model of particular importance for adolescents. Next, please. She's an award-winning songwriter, singer, classically trained flutist who's played with philharmonic orchestras and has appeared in videos on TV and in movies. She became a mainstream, she's crossed over into the mainstream when she was the Time Magazine 2019 Entertainer of the Year. She has said she is the first big Black woman on the cover of Vogue. She's a social activist promoting self-care, self-love, health, diversity, and inclusivity. And she is a major influencer on Instagram and TikTok platforms for millions of followers and hundreds of millions liking her posts that are very positive about body image. She's quoted in Teen Vogue as saying, "I want to put people who look like me in the mainstream. I want visibility and fairness," so social justice. Next, please. So this social justice really is encompassed in this body code of body image, which was originated in Australia, but now widely adopted in the fashion, media, and advertising industry. And I see I really don't have time to go through all of these, except that there is indeed overall an emphasis on a positive content and images, diversity and inclusiveness and advertising, both in print media and also broadcast media, realistic images without using techniques to slim people down, healthy weight models, appropriate modeling age 16 or older for adult clothes, and then the fashion retailers adopting and supporting body images by carrying clothes that really suit their clientele. So outcomes, for example, have been that there are plus size models on Fashion Week and in swim and surf shows. Next, please. Next, please. And many body positivity examples. I think we're moving to a more salutogenic environment. Fat is beginning to lose its bad or insulting term. Sizeism has been critically evaluated as no longer socially acceptable in many areas. The fatkini movement, here's the most revealing of public garments that we wear are swimsuits, and individuals of all sizes and shapes are posting these images. Also, there are articles, blogs, postings, YouTube videos by influencers like Lizzo, as well as many others, on healthy lifestyles, not weight, challenging attitudes, asking people to speak up if they hear things like fat jokes that are demeaning, and even burning diet books and throwing away scales. Even the National Organization of Women has designated October 14th to be Love Your Body Day, and they produce materials for use by teachers and also college students. The What's Underneath project is one in which we're refocusing attention in a very positive salutogenic way on function and not form. And so this is an emphasis on really seeing your body. Here's an example I'm going to just quickly read. Your body made sure you woke up this morning, ate and digested nutrients to help your brain feel alert. So many people spend too much time bashing their bodies. They miss out on the wonderful things it does for them. So reframing, looking from form to function, and appreciating body functions. And finally, the last issue is really a human rights or social rights issue, really reframing this in terms of activism, both the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance, the Obesity Action Coalition, really looking at this and a different framework of social justice. So in conclusion, I've taken us on a journey from DNA genes to denim genes. Both are modified by a number of different processes over which we have some control. I've emphasized body size, subject to a number of epigenetic modifications. And I'm about to conclude, as we begin more thorough understanding of the mechanisms involved in epigenetics, we can make salutogenic choices that increase our physical and psychosocial well-being by both altering our genes with a G and our genes with a J. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? So much, Dr. Lieberman, for that great presentation, for the deep dive into epigenetics and the real life example of PACEs and weight bias. So we really appreciate that information. Our final speaker is Dr. Asim Jani. He is a medical director for the Division of Disease Control and Health Protection with the Florida Department of Health. Thank you, Dr. Jani. I have to say he's my friend. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. I hope you can hear me, Candice.
Yes.
And great talk, Leslie, Dr. Lieberman.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. It was really great. It was a good transition to this next set of topics that I'd like to discuss. So uh, the real thanks are in order for the organizers, especially PJI and Kelsey and the team, to really initiate this conference to begin with several years ago, and then of course to take up this theme and to really pull it off in a virtual environment. So definitely thank you, everyone. I have no disclosures, and in terms of the outline, I would say that we are aiming to get through a little bit of the review of the concept of salutogenesis, perhaps a new term to all of you, and the structural inequities piece, which is also important, to differentiate ACEs and PACEs, which you heard about from this morning from Dr. Nakasawa, and to describe the conceptual framework of the pair of ACEs, as she also alluded to it. I'd like to articulate the relative a positive impact of lifestyle, dietary changes, mindfulness, meditation, and all of these things on our genes, our cellular functions, some of which Dr. Lieberman alluded to. And then, of course, to review the significance of building community resilience, sort of how does one go about doing this? And we'll try to certainly leave plenty of time for questions. So I think we should start out with the larger system issue, which is that of healthcare. And in many ways, being a healthcare provider myself for the last 30 years, and having a bunch of different experiences in patient care and public health, I have to admit that perhaps this is not the most accurate title for the system that we work in. And I would posit that our healthcare system is in fact really good and really focused on getting sick people healthier, which by definition could mean that we have a great sick care system, or one that certainly we want to improve, and that healthcare as a system is something we still have aspiration for. Our healthcare system is in fact based on incentivizing dealing with problems after they happen and not necessarily preventing them. For example, relative to the US national healthcare expenditure every year on an annual basis, people may not be aware, but only 3%, less than 3% of the $3 trillion plus that's spent on healthcare is actually given towards public health and prevention. That's a sobering statistic, especially given the fact that we are still battling all the aspects of a pandemic. That said, about 2/3 of that pie chart, 2/3 of that healthcare expenditure is actually going towards things like hospitals, payers, physicians, prescription drugs, home health care, and other things. So you sort of get the idea that we're really talking more about damage control and recovery rather than wellness, which is going to be the focus of much of what we'll talk about. So what creates health? That's a fundamentally important question. And I think as people sort of have looked at this, there are maybe some slightly different ways of perceiving this, but this is a good schematic, especially since we're talking about the components of genetics, which is that about really 10% of our overall health is probably contributed and controlled and modulated by our genes and our biology, our genetic code. 10% is about our physical environment, sort of the air we breathe and where we walk, etc. Clinical care, my particular field and that of Candice Jones and others of clinical care and taking care of patients is really only 10 to maybe 20% of the variability. About 30% is sort of owned by each of us as individual patients or people who want to stay healthy. But almost 40% plus is really determined by social and economic factors. And this is really important because all of these things together, we have to focus on when we're talking about a healthy population. So that said, I wanted to bring up the idea of salutogenesis, and let me do that by introducing one of my heroes, Dr. Aaron Antonovsky. Would have given anything to have met him, but he died in the 1990s, well before I even knew about any of this stuff. And he was a Israeli social scientist. He was a real visionary. He had a groundbreaking new paradigm that he presented to the world, and many researchers, his students and other people, have actually continued to follow the tradition and work on salutogenesis, which I'll define in a minute. His major two books, where the first was Health, Stress, and Coping, and then years later, Unraveling the Mystery of Health. His research was very broad, and it emphasized many different vulnerable and traumatized populations. One of the groups that he looked at were female Holocaust survivors. And one of the key findings, which you would expect, was that, of course, those women were overall, relative to a group of individuals who may not have necessarily had concentration camp experiences and terrible things like that, they had some adjustment challenges after they survived and left the camps. But an amazing finding was that he discovered that there was a sizable, large proportion of these individuals who had actually much higher functioning and much greater grounding in health and wellness than would have otherwise appeared. And when he asked them a series of questions to try to delve into this, he found that the survivors who had done especially well and who weren't necessarily traumatized years later, whose health was good, whose mental and emotional health was really good, they were highly functioning, were individuals who had, before, during, and after the camp experience, had found existential meaning inside themselves, a source of deep meaningfulness and health that motivated them to not only adapt but survive. Very much akin to the research that Viktor Frankl did when he wrote his book, Man's Search for Meaning. This internal sense of how the world works and how their place is in the world allowed them to connect with the inner sources of health and wholeness and healing, despite the horrors that they were witnessing and actually enduring. So when Aaron Antonovsky observed this and other things from these groups, he actually came up with the theory of a model of salutogenesis. Saluto is Latin for health, and genesis is the creation of. And much like the analogy that I gave of sick care versus well care or health care, salutogenesis can be also pitted against pathogenesis, which is essentially the model that all of us as healthcare professionals and public health professionals really learn from. We first and foremost learn about what goes wrong. I mean, we transiently go through what is normal anatomy, normal biochemistry, but very quickly our profession and our identity is defined by knowing about disease, how it takes place, how it occurs, what are the risk factors, and that's what we call pathogenesis. And so we get really good at understanding and treating people with disease. But if you look at this from a salutogenic point of view, you'd have to ask the question, well, is health merely the absence of disease or recovery from disease? Or does it mean something else, something that those Israeli women knew deep down when they stepped into the Holocaust, those camps? They weren't maybe consciously aware, but they really did know what was going to keep them healthy. And that was the question of what does create wellness and health. And so, of course, this idea of how do we create and promote positive states of well-being and health is really fundamental to our discussion about trauma, about how our genes may be modified, and many other things. So when we think about salutogenesis, this is a graphic that corresponds to the quote, which is from Aaron Antonovsky, that he said, "We are coming to understand health not as the absence of disease, but rather as the process by which individuals maintain their sense of coherence and ability to function in the face of changes in themselves and in their relationships with their environment." So you can begin to see how if we actually take a salutogenic approach to ACEs, we can now start understanding what the speaker this morning spent a wonderful amount of time talking about, which is our inherent ability to have both our behaviors, our social supports, our mindset, our spirit to influence and our health, and maybe balance some of the things that we know harms us. And this sense of coherence, which is in the middle of this arrow, this big broad arrow, you see is that deep down source of health. Well, it turns out that it's on a spectrum. If you go to the left and you find that those resources that you need to stay healthy are actually deficient, what he called the general resistance deficits, then that's not going to favor you, and you might have a bad outcome. But on the flip side, if in fact you have a salutogenic approach, there are a series of things called general resistance resources, which we'll talk about in a second, which in concert with your own cooperation for your own individual health can really improve your overall health. And this is what we're going to be getting at. So what are some of these general resistance resources? Well, another name for them in my book is the determinants of health. Those factors that either on an intermediary basis or socioeconomic position or socioeconomic and political context can help determine our health and have a tremendous impact on our health equity. So if you zoom out, you sort of go out and you see all of these things in operation. First, we realize we have material circumstances, we have habits, we have biological factors and healthcare access. And these are the immediate things that we can try to understand and deal with, and we feel them. But those things are actually in turn influenced by more upstream social determinants, such as the social groups to which we belong and our occupations, our income, even other factors like transportation, food security, or lack thereof, or environment. And then, of course, if we zoom out even further, we look at broader socioeconomic policies, health policy, who has health insurance in this country and who doesn't? What about our culture and societal values? Who leads us? And what about those decisions and how we're influenced? So all of those things do factor in. And I think it's really important for us to sort of keep all of that in mind as we move forward. So we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the term equity vis-a-vis the other two terms, equality and justice. So equality is when everyone gets the same benefits, and you sort of see that with this diagram on the left. Everyone's getting the same size box, but one of those individuals can't see beyond the fence. Equity, on the other hand, is critically factoring in where those individuals start. So to provide supports that align with their specific needs that they have. At least then everyone can get sort of the view of the field in this diagram. They can sort of begin to see and have the same access. But really, deep down, the next question is even larger and more significant, which is, what are the root causes of inequity to begin with? And can we, in fact, reduce key barriers to the achievement of health? And like we see here, that everybody has a clear view, and they may not even necessarily need those same types of supports because they're inherently built into the justice fabric that we've woven. Like I always think of Cornel West, one of my heroes. He says, justice is what love looks like in public. And we would be really off if we speak of love and justice and equity without mentioning this quote and the towering figure of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. So, in fact, as we think about all of this, we realize that health disparities and epigenetics are actually linked. And here's a schematic that sort of begins to approach that concept. You have the social determinants of health characterized by the cartoon with the house and the books and other things. These are all things that really are very important, as we talked about. They're related to race, ethnicity, access, etc. But those social determinants of health, as they affect the onset or the mitigation or the prevention of disease in our lifetime, they are modulated at the individual level with our genes, by our genes. And in fact, these epigenetic modifications, many of the mechanisms that Dr. Lieberman so nicely talked about, histone modification, methylation, mRNA expression, etc. These are things that, as we'll see as this talk goes on, these are things that we can in fact do something about. And the speaker this morning even started mentioning a lot of this. So as we look at disease risk over the lifespan, we see early life diseases, midlife conditions, late life conditions, and all of these have the potential to be influenced not only by those things like ACEs, but also by things that we can do after we sort of have the light bulb go off and we understand how we can try to influence these. So it turns out that adverse childhood experiences, as was mentioned this morning, that particular model, I think some 10, 20 years ago, has really revolutionized the way we think about health, or it should. And this triangle, this pyramid that you see, is very famous. It presents the mechanisms by which ACEs influences health and well-being throughout our lifespan. You have ACEs at the beginning that we talked about that are developmentally impactful. You have disrupted neurodevelopment. You have social, cognitive, and emotional impairment. You often have then adopt high-risk behaviors, which then lead to disability, disease, social problems, and of course, premature death, as was talked about. Along the way, there are many of these determinants that can be operational at the personal, community, and environmental levels. But all of this, as sobering as it is, there's not all bad news. And here's the reason why, is that we know that there's an ubiquitous impact of ACEs. And in fact, this diagram shows something called population attributable risk. It's a fancy way of saying, epidemiologists will use this term to describe the proportion of a disease or condition that can be attributed to X number of causes, in this case, ACEs. And really what we're trying to talk about is that middle area that looks kind of amorphous, where you see all those 50s and 55s and 60s in there as percentages. These are the percentages of the outcomes that are due to ACEs. Therefore, what this sets us up for is this idea that maybe we don't need to just work harder and get the achievement that, or the outcomes we want. Maybe we should work smarter. When we're trying to actually improve population health, if we can address ACEs widely, not only, as the speaker said, would our DSM-5 book come down to a pamphlet, but many of these other social and medical and really life-threatening conditions can be really impacted at once, all at once. And this is really talking about how addressing ACEs can widely, efficiently, and effectively improve positive health outcomes, things that are not even connected by funding, logistics, etc. So the pair of ACEs comment, the description was made this morning. I won't belabor it, but the idea is that there is the ACEs that we all have been talking about, adverse childhood experiences. There's the other ACE, which is the adverse community environments, which deal with that whole component of social and structural determinants of health. But now we know that there are three realms of ACEs, the third one being, of course, what's happening in the environment. And anyone would have to just turn on the news or look outside or even look at our natural disasters that we're experiencing to understand that climate change and natural disasters have an enormous impact on the structural disparities, structural determinants of health, the disparities that occur due to vulnerable populations often getting disproportionately negatively impacted, as well as at the individual level. So all of these things come together, and we can work on all three levels and hope to improve health. So adversity, as Einstein said, in the middle of adversity, there is great opportunity. And I think this theme was, in fact, quite nicely articulated this morning when the doctor talked about PACEs and not just ACEs. So the organization ACEs Connection is in fact opted to change its name. And they have a whole write-up that's worth reading on why we changed our name. And it turns out that ACEs Connection is now the PACES Connection. And PACES stands for Positive and Adverse Childhood Experiences. So what is the influence of these positive childhood experiences? Well, it was mentioned this morning, but I'll just run through it here, that there are these 7, thanks to Lindsay Bramman and others, that are mentioned. The ability to talk with family about feelings, having the experience that the family is there to support them, or enjoyment in community traditions, feeling of belonging across the school years, especially in high school, feeling of being supported by friends, having at least 2 non-parent adults who genuinely care, and then feeling safe and protected by an adult at home. All of these things have been actually shown that by reducing ACEs and increasing PCs or PACEs, the positive experiences, contributes to growing resilient kids who are able now to become healthier adults. So this is a whole talk in and of itself, but very exciting that we can start influencing the damage, if you will, and mitigating the damage that's been there due to ACEs. And sort of, how does this capacity for resilience really work? How does it look like? What does it look like? Well, there's a nice video that's on this PACES Connection website, and these are just a few of the screenshots. It's worth going through. So the scale for this fulcrum that you see, and the sort of the scale that's there, it's really about the capacity for resilience. And what you see on the left-hand side is that when we're born and we're very vulnerable, we are not very resilient. So our fulcrum is sort of set on the far end of the spectrum there, and we are less resilient, which means that even just a few of the major negative experiences, the adverse childhood experiences, can really tip the balance, and we may wind up having disease and disability and all of that start. The seeds are sown, and we may not be able to escape those effects. But on the flip side, if you, through your epigenetic modification, or for that matter, through an increment in positive childhood experiences and positive supports in your life, you start shifting the balance, then you can get what's shown on the right-hand corner, which is that you actually change the fulcrum and you become more resilient. And as you become more resilient, now you tip the balance towards health and salutogenesis. And so this is a very important concept, that epigenetics, as well as the positive experiences that we can have and positive supports, can all shift the balance, and we are not necessarily obligated to have a bad outcome. Here's a great study that really shows the powerful impact of lifestyle changes, even on things like cancer. And this is, of course, a study. It's not generalizable to every cancer and every type of lifestyle change, but it does show us the powerful potential for this. Dean Ornish looked at 93 men almost now 15 years ago, and all these individuals had early stage prostate cancer. And one group, he encouraged them to eat a low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet. They had stress reduction, yoga, meditation, moderate exercise. The other group had really no lifestyle or diet changes. After a year, all of the men in the group that got the healthy lifestyle changes had a decrease in their prostatic specific antigen, or their tumor marker for prostate cancer, and it went down. And none, in fact, required any treatment for their cancer. Now, in the control group, there was a statistically significant rise in their PSAs. And in fact, 6 of the men actually had to get medical intervention for progression of disease. What's really remarkable on a DNA level is that he showed 500 genes plus were actually altered by this diet and lifestyle intervention. So that was very, very encouraging. And it tells us that there are things that we can do as basic as our diet, our exercise, our mindfulness and stress reduction that can influence our the genetic impact of many of these diseases that we're vulnerable to getting. And in COVID world, we would be remiss if we didn't mention, and Dr. Lieberman did mention it earlier in her talk, but we see the influence of epigenetics where two people, in fact, who are otherwise very similar, even within the same race or the same socioeconomic background or health conditions, can have very different outcomes with a comparable amount of COVID-19 virus in their system. And biologically, this otherwise shouldn't make sense, but in fact it does. We do find that there may be differences in the levels of dysregulation that occur in inner epigenetic environments. So this is really an important point. And as we sort of wrap up, I wanted to just share some really great information with you that was, again, talked about this morning, but this is one particular schematic which shows the power of mind over matter, that there's mitigation of the negative impact of ACEs and childhood trauma by mindfulness training. And what you see here is a sort of a diagram that talks about the intricate complexities of these different factors into changes in neurobiology and metabolism and inflammatory markers, much of what Dr. Lieberman talked about. But here are three different areas. And just like we see cancer chemotherapy or HIV drugs working at multiple sites, so also we can have the learned practice of mindfulness that can mitigate the negative impact of ACEs and childhood trauma at different sites. So we have mindfulness that can modulate a positive outcome from trauma to mental health. We certainly know that mindfulness can help with behavioral factors such as poor lifestyle and sleep. We also know that mindfulness can have direct implications for our neurobiology. And in fact, one of the most interesting studies was this one that was referred to, where meditation, the systematic practice of meditation, can in fact lengthen our telomeres, which was the end of the chromosomal structures that can help determine our lifespan. So short telomeres, short life, longer ones with meditation and other practices can, of course, give us longevity and quality life. And the last couple of slides, just to tell you about this. This is really important, right? That we talk about resilience. This conference is focused on resilience, and community resilience is the key in so many ways. This particular cookbook is a great resource. It helps providers form key partnerships with other organizations to help the affected, traumatized populations in a community. We know that we at least have 6 key ingredients, these being leadership and collaboration. We have community education, resources, communication, data, research, and our mindset. These are things that we have to operationalize. And in fact, if we think about what that looks like, we have to ask ourselves, well, just how do communities build resilience? Well, Ellis and Dietz have articulated this in a beautiful article. This is a schematic from that article. And the schematic really shows that there's a process here, a process of assessment and readiness and implementation and sustainability that is necessary. And the schematic shows that there are 4 parts, if you will, of the circle: shared understanding, state of readiness, cross-sector partnerships that can form, and an engaged community. These are ingredients or 4 key things that you need. And each of these has components such as provider capacity or policy supports or collaboration and resource distribution, or in fact, do communities have organizational linkages, or are their citizens engaged? And for that matter, when we talk about ACEs, is there a trauma-informed community, and is there resilience, and are steps being taken to increase resilience, and listening to the narratives of the community? So all of these things are really important at the community level, but all of them ultimately feed back into that individual. So I would just leave you with a couple of favorite quotes, some parting wisdom, not mine, but belonging to Van der Kolk and Donna Bedian. Van der Kolk, who wrote this famous book that's currently in circulation called The Body Keeps the Score. Very, very beautiful book. He writes, social support is the most powerful protection against becoming overwhelmed by stress and trauma. The critical issue is reciprocity. which means being truly heard and seen by the people around us, feeling that we are held in someone else's mind and heart. Well, the feeling that we're held in someone else's mind or heart, or that we hold someone else in our mind and heart, another word for that is love. And in fact, Don Abedian, the father of quality improvement and assurance, a physician poet, very beautifully said, we are all stewards of something precious. Ultimately, the secret of quality, I would say the secret of health, is love. Self-love, love for those who are traumatized, love for our community, and love for our planet. So I hope that in these few minutes that I've spent with you, Dr. Lieberman and I have tried in many ways to discuss the concepts that we talk about, including salutogenesis, structural inequities, and the differences between ACEs and PACEs and how things go together. We've tried to articulate the positive impact of epigenetic factors and what we can do about them at an individual level, and of course touched on community resilience. So thank you again for your attention. This is my contact information. Please feel free to reach out to me by email or phone. And I will stop sharing my screen, Candice, and turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Jani. That was another excellent presentation. Phenomenal. Thank you for those solutions at the end, that model by Dr. Wendy Ellis. I see us those areas in Central Florida, and I look forward to us completing those levels with all of us working together, of course. Thank you for that. Now we will take questions from our audience, and we don't have many questions, so that will give you guys plenty of time and to share more information. But I do have, so please, if you're thinking of anything, I know this was so rich that I think everybody's just in deep thought right now. I know I am. So ask questions. We have time. This doesn't end until 2:30, so we have about 20 minutes. And so please put your questions in the Q&A. I'm looking. Dr. Jani does ask Dr. Lieberman, with your anthropology background, what do you think Margaret Mead, and you could remind me who that is, or think about all these topics, ACEs, the role of epigenetics, and taking a health creation approach?
Wow. That's an interesting question. So Margaret Mead was really one of the founders of American anthropology as a sociocultural anthropologist, but in that day, in the 1920s and 30s, and she lived into the 60s, I believe, it really encompassed everything. So both the biological history as well as sociocultural, even archaeology. She did one of her initial, actually it was her dissertation on growing up in Samoa, a classic study which she did because she wanted to contest the prevailing Freudian notions of sexuality of the day. And in Samoa, young women were quite sexually active. I won't use promiscuous. It's quite sexually active. And so what she did was really contrast what was happening in Samoa among adolescents with what was happening in the United States and Europe. What she did find, of course, in terms of social support and lifestyle, was a much simpler society in terms of distractions, and quite supportive in terms of the lifestyles of children growing up, very supportive. In Sex and Temperament, another book that she wrote, she found that there was also some role reversal of males and females, and that males were very attentive and involved with childcare. So much more active than has been traditional in our Western tradition. I think that's changing, that has been changing right along. So I'm not sure what you would think about adverse effects. That's a really good question. I would want to go back and read these ethnographic accounts of other societies to look at it. So I think it's a great question. I'm not sure I have the answer to that. But of course, she was living in a different time as well. Contemporary anthropologists do, in fact, often participate in public health activities. They involve a number of looks at and interpretations of social determinants of health and operate in a number of sectors. I think, again, with an anthropological perspective, one would have to be more culturally specific. That is, appreciating the diversity of cultural approaches and behavioral approaches to dealing with adverse events of childhood or adverse childhood experiences would have to be looked at in the entire cultural context. Of course, there have been some critical assessments of early child rearing practices. Popular. Maybe I'm just wondering. I don't know how many more questions do you have?
Yeah, we have some. We have some.
All right. Well,
Thank you for that.
I'll just stop with one comment that there was a group of psychological anthropologists active in the 30s and 40s, and what they emphasized were some of the issues such as child swaddling as a way of looking at issues of national culture. So early childhood, what we would now consider probably adverse activities in terms of infant and child constraints. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Lieberman. So Carolyn asked, in addition to meditation practice, what role does faith play in health creation? Any studies along these lines?
Sure. Dr. Lieberman, if you want to take a shot at that too, please. I do have some thoughts on that, but
go ahead.
So thank you. So I can't really speak to specific studies per se right now, but without sort of refreshing my memory. But I will say that, if you look at one dimension of faith, which is, of course, prayer, and it's a universal component, right, in very different, diverse wisdom traditions. The act of prayer, the symbolism of prayer as an active intervention, if you will, not only for one's own salvation, but one's family, one's community, one's planet. These are important things. Prayer has actually been shown in some studies that were controlled to have a tremendous influence on the health outcomes. There was a very famous one, the details of which maybe Candice, you might remember, but one in which they took cardiac patients and sort of had positive outcomes, whether it was of a coronary atherosclerotic related outcome, but of people praying for individuals who might have had heart disease and having better outcomes. So this is just a sort of a snippet into this idea that prayer and has this effect. I would like to focus on one dimension that wasn't get talked about, and that speaks to part of what was discussed earlier this morning, that we look for in our sort of Aristotelian derived models, we look for a reductionist approach to many things. We're not wrong in doing that. We found this morning that the microglial cell, for example, could be the organic connection between mind and body. Very, very legitimate perspective. But in a way, there's another perspective to this, which is asking the question, if we keep pushing this envelope going farther and farther upstream, there are systems theorists, there are quantum physicists such as Fritjof Capra and others who actually have made the case that there's something called consciousness, an actual phenomenon that is rooted in quantum mechanics, that is rooted in aspects of physics that we don't necessarily always talk about, certainly not Newtonian physics, but non-Newtonian physics, in which consciousness as an operating principle may be, in fact, the determining factor for why we are structured the way we are, why our genes work the way they do, why our body, our organic systems do. And in fact, I bring that up because faith, as something that is normally pitted vis-a-vis or in contrast to science, seems to have this sort of nebulous, mystical quality, and we can just talk about it, but it's really not in the realm of science. But now, consciousness, as put forth by the quantum physicists, some of the hardest sciences that are out there, they're actually making these links. And they're saying that maybe the idea of faith and spirit and consciousness are not terms outside of science, but they are within science, a broader perspective. And so I think that just like any scientific variable, consciousness and faith have probably much more inherent power than we give them credit for. And much of what we can do to influence our own genes, our own health, has to do with meditation, introspection, imaging, all of these things. And faith has a huge part to play, as we know. Ultimately, I'll leave you with a wonderful quote from an Indian teacher who wrote that faith is the final cure. Faith is what drugs are. They are given to the body, but it's the faith in the drugs that actually cures the cells. So it's sort of taking a quantum view of this, right? So anyway, I'll stop there.
That's good. We have two more questions. Dr. Lieberman, would you like to comment on that last question?
I was just going to say that again, cross-culturally, if you look at traditional healers, shaman, others in traditional, often small populations, you find that much of that healing takes place because of the belief in the efficacy of the healer. So yes.
Amazing. Oh, you guys are deep today. I love it. So Susan says, I agree, love is the solution to many and societal challenges. Unfortunately, love can't be measured, so it's not considered in the research or implemented in practice. What's the solution? Whoever wants to take that.
I will maybe go first again, but I'll make sure I speak less. And Candice, you'll have to help me out. She's a very famous author who's written about shame and
Brene Brown.
Brene Brown, right? She, in fact, has actually, as a psychologist, as a researcher, I think she was a psychologist and a scientist. She has, in fact, given measurements and definitions of love that I think could stand shoulder to shoulder to anyone who wants to create sort of a qualitative research paradigm. The idea here is that love is, again, to go to quantum physics, it's an energy. We think of it as an emotion, and as an emotion, it's powerful. But I would argue that when we look at love as an operating principle of the universe in our own lives, as what, for example, Cornel West said about justice being what love looks like in public. The idea that love is an energy itself, well, energy forms can be measured. Maybe they can't be measured in the way that we think of Aristotelian science, which has sort of dogmatized our approaches and looking at statistical theory and probability as the answer to everything. I would submit to you that there are sciences like yoga, which is not about standing on your head as much as it is a very elaborate, deep science that's been around for a few thousand years, in which there is an entire topography and a metaphysical dimension explored in extreme nuances about what happens within, right? Which is not something that's without. So there's measurements and there's taxonomies and there's vocabulary there. So love and all of this do have measurements. We have to look in the right places.
Dr. Lieberman, what are your thoughts?
I can't follow that. I think it's beautifully said. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jani.
So we have two more questions and we have time, I think, to take them 8 more minutes. So let's see. Oh, we're 3 now. I love it, guys. Thanks. So Mary says, Dr. Jani, how widely used is genetic epidemiologic research in cross sectors related to policy? For instance, early childhood care and education and ACEs, cancer therapies and healthcare policy, etc.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would give a very short answer, which is I really don't know. I know about genomic epidemiology in my part of the world, which is having to do with things like COVID variants and tracking those types of infectious disease pathogens. I am aware that there are genomic epidemiologic correlations with chronic disease, with cancer, with other risk factors, even and certain behaviors, health behaviors. I would argue that there's a huge body of research that's probably burgeoning if it's not already there. And Leslie, if you have any comments on that.
Well, I think that in terms of some policies, there's been work to try to and obesity, certainly work at the international, national, and local levels, including school lunches, to try to manage that environment, the eating environment, and food that's available. And some of that is related to good health. Some of it's related to try to counter some of the epigenetic mechanisms that can account for risk for increases in body weight or a risk in overeating. So I think that some of that also takes place, that we are seeing more of the considerations of genetic factors and epigenetic factors in terms of policies.
Awesome. So let's see. Rudy asked, Dr. Jani, you mentioned the significance of the epigenetics and COVID-19 slide that spoke to the fatality risk. More on that.
Sure. So it's it does really, and we can take it offline. Please feel free to contact me and we can talk more about it. But there is a lot of science that is being discovered really about this, what we call epigenetic dysregulation. And what we're really talking about there is that at the cellular level, the interaction between the virus, the actual host cell machinery, which spews out more virus and causes replication, and the inflammatory cascade, those types of chemical mediators that cause inflammation and that often supersede the damage from the virus. All of those things are ultimately genetically determined. And we know that there may be post genetic processing or sort of post post transcription, which is one of the parts of the genetic process of post transcription and post translational methylation, for example, and other types of processes that can influence to what degree someone is going to have an inflammatory cytokine cascade and have a lot of disease, a lot of inflammation, thrombosis, or hypotension or lung problems, and who doesn't. And so I think it's not just COVID. There are a lot of viruses and a lot of pathogens that have this interaction. But great question, a lot of science, a lot of unknowns.
Anything you want to add to that, Dr. Lieberman?
I don't think so. I did have one mention of the ACEs, which is the angiotensin converting enzyme, which is so critical in terms of the biological processes involved in control of blood pressure, but also diabetes and other regulatory systems, and how that really is the target, that particular molecule, which is on the outside of the cell, is a target for the COVID virus, and it takes over the machinery of the cell. So as we know from the epidemiological literature, having conditions of hypertension or diabetes confer additional risk for poor outcomes, for more severe disease. And I think we're beginning to understand the molecular mechanisms that are involved in that, as Dr. Jani mentioned. And it may be, as you also mentioned, a way of understanding what happens with these individuals who suffer longer term disabilities post the acute episode of COVID-19. So we're just beginning, I think, to be able to look at this group that show persistent disability.
Definitely a lot more to learn there. I think we can squeeze in one more question. Probably the last two, because one is a really cute comment, I think. So Jackie, and this is my pediatric doctor friend from Baltimore that I worked with out of residency at Hopkins. Thank you for being here, Jackie. Aren't the two involved adults spoken of in PACES nothing more than love in action? Anybody have comment on that?
Well, sure, to be clear, the two adults, who is she referring to, just to...
Jackie, you want to clarify that for us? And then I will go to Carolyn. Dr. Jani, what's the title of your next book? And I agree. Like anytime I want to get deep and really look at a complete picture of something, I call him Jani.
Well, I don't have a title, but I will tell you that one of the things that I'm actively working on is making Rudolf Virchow relevant to the 21st century. He was a polymath and a great hero of mine, and that's definitely got to be one of the books that I'm going to write. Yeah.
Tell us who that is.
So Rudolf Virchow was really the father of pathology in many ways, but he was an anthropologist, a pathologist, a public health physician, an epidemiologist, an archaeologist, a prolific writer, lived in the 19th century, taught Sir William Osler how to do autopsies, but was a fierce public health advocate and put everything together at the systems level way before his time.
So he's probably in one of those big books I have in my office, right?
It is.
I remember that last name, but I wasn't quite sure. So Jackie does clarify, and I think we have 1 minute, mentioned that someone mentioned that two involved adults acted as a protective factor even when child had high ACEs. Yes.
Right. I don't know specifically what the reference was to that, but the way I read it was that in, our evolving structure of what is a family and who are really caregivers to children, I believe that is a good apt description for two people, usually a balance of some sort, yin and yang energy or whatever you want to call it. But there are at least two people who can potentially serve as caregivers and having those parental roles. And I believe that if they're caring, that would be great.
And I think the literature out of Harvard, really supports one caring adult. Stable, nurturing environment really makes a difference. Dr. Lieberman, did you have any last words?
Well, perhaps it takes a village.
It does.
Absolutely.
It does. Thank you to our phenomenal speakers and our audience for joining us and for such great questions. I hope we all learned about ACEs, that ACEs have tremendous impact, but that it is not our destiny and our health is in our hands. I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you so much again, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Candice.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Take care. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. Jani.